My name was Emily. I worked in Denmark, in a system the world praises. A country held up as proof that justice can be clean, that power can be gentle, that human rights are more than just words. I believed that too, at least in the beginning. I wore my badge like a shield, convinced it protected me from guilt. I am telling this story now because silence has started to feel heavier than fear. I was part of a government unit that handled detentions and asylum-related enforcement. On paper, it was administrative work, interviews, assessments, risk evaluations, decisions made behind desks, not bars. That's how it was explained to us. That's how I explained it to myself. But the truth is simpler and uglier. I was one of the women whose signature could take a Muslim woman away. I am Christian. Not deeply religious, not devout, not someone who prayed every night. Christianity for me was cultural, a background detail, something I never thought would matter in my work. I told myself religion had nothing to do with my decisions, that I was neutral, objective, professional. That was a lie. The women who came through our system were almost always the same. Muslim, usually wearing hijab, often alone, sometimes with children clinging to their coats, confused by languages they didn't understand, and rooms that smelled like disinfectant and fear. Their files were thick with words like risk, noncompliance, security concern. Words that sounded important enough to replace empathy. We didn't call them women. We didn't even call them people. We called them cases. I remember the first time I signed an arrest authorization. My hand didn't shake. I read the summary. People imagine Denmark as light, bright offices, open windows, transparency. They imagine fairness as something you can see. But the places where I worked were not bright. They were quiet. Too quiet. The kind of silence that isn't peaceful. It's controlled. There were no bars on the windows where visitors were allowed. No chains, no screaming. That's how the system protects itself. Violence here doesn't look violent, it looks procedural. The detention areas were never called prisons. That word was forbidden. We used phrases like temporary holding, administrative custody, processing delay. Language was our first weapon. Once you remove the word prison, everything that happens inside becomes easier to justify. The corridors were always cold. White walls, pale floors, no clocks, no windows low enough to look out of. Time disappeared in those places, and I learned quickly that when people lose track of time, they also lose strength. Most of the women were Muslim. That was never written officially, but everyone knew. It showed in their names, their clothes, the way they lowered their eyes when male officers passed, the way they whispered prayers under their breath when they thought no one was listening. Some spoke Danish badly, others not at all. Many came from war, from broken homes, from places where fear followed them even into sleep. We were trained to see patterns. Hijab meant non-integrated. Silence meant uncooperative. Tears meant manipulative. And faith, especially Islamic faith, was treated like a warning sign. I watched women sit across from me in interview rooms, their hands folded tightly in their laps, fingers pressing into skin as if holding themselves together. I asked questions in a calm voice. I smiled, I nodded, and all the while I was already deciding their future. Sometimes they begged, sometimes they didn't. The ones who didn't scared me more. Children were the worst part, not because they cried, but because they didn't always understand. I remember one little girl, maybe 6 years old, holding onto her mother's sleeve while officers explained that they would be separated temporarily. The child asked if her mother was being punished. No one answered her. We don't answer questions that don't fit the form. We told ourselves we weren't hurting anyone. We're just enforcing the law. We don't make the rules. They'll be fine. That last lie was the most dangerous. Behind the interview rooms were the holding areas. You won't find photos of them in brochures. Narrow rooms, heavy doors, lights that stayed on all night, women sitting on metal benches, sometimes for hours, sometimes overnight, waiting to be moved, questioned, transferred. I walked those corridors every day. I heard whispered prayers in languages I didn't understand. I saw women trace invisible patterns on their palms to calm themselves. I noticed how they flinched when footsteps approached, even when no one had ever hit them. Fear doesn't need bruises to leave marks. And still, I did my job. I signed papers. I approved detentions. I justified decisions using policy language that sounded clean enough to drown out conscience. Every signature felt smaller than the last, less significant, easier. That's how systems work. They don't ask you to become cruel all at once. They ask you to become comfortable. Comfortable with silence, comfortable with other people's suffering, comfortable enough to believe that if something were truly wrong, someone else would stop it. I didn't know then that one woman, one file, would tear that comfort apart. And when it happened, there would be no language clean enough to protect me. I used to tell myself I wasn't cruel. That word felt too heavy, too dramatic, something reserved for monsters. I wasn't shouting at anyone. I wasn't dragging women by their hair. I didn't raise my voice or slam my fists on tables. I wore clean clothes. I spoke politely. I followed procedure. That's how it started. Cruelty doesn't always arrive screaming. Sometimes it comes quietly, dressed as responsibility. I grew up hearing stories about danger, about threats that looked ordinary, about communities that didn't integrate, about beliefs that were incompatible. None of it sounded like hate when it was spoken calmly in classrooms, meetings, and training sessions. It sounded like caution, like intelligence, like protection. And I wanted to be seen as competent. In our unit, patterns were everything. We were taught to trust data more than instinct, reports more than people. Over time, I noticed something uncomfortable, and instead of questioning it, I leaned into it. Most of the cases that escalated, most of the files marked urgent or high risk, belonged to Muslim women. At first, I told myself it was coincidence. Then I told myself it was cultural. Then I told myself it was necessary. I began to expect resistance before it happened. I listened for defiance, even in silence. When a Muslim woman hesitated before answering, I read it as deception. When she asked for clarification, I saw manipulation. When she mentioned faith, prayer, or modesty, I flagged it as non-compliance. I never wrote Istal Beza because she is Muslim. I didn't have to. The system already knew how to translate my concerns. There was a subtle reward for this behavior. Files moved faster when I raised concerns. Supervisors nodded approvingly when I used the right language. I was praised for being thorough, for not being naive. I became reliable, trusted. Someone who could be counted on to make hard decisions without hesitation. Power doesn't announce itself. It grows quietly when no one challenges you. I remember one meeting clearly. A senior officer leaned back in his chair and said, half joking, "At least you're not afraid to deal with them." Everyone laughed. I laughed too. I didn't ask who them was supposed to be. That was the moment something inside me shifted. From then on, detentions became easier to justify. I stopped asking myself whether arrest was truly necessary and started asking whether I could defend it on paper. That was the only question that mattered anymore. And the truth, the part I avoided for a long time, is this: I liked the control. I liked watching fear replace confidence. I liked how quickly voices softened once my decision was made. I liked knowing that a woman sitting across from me had no idea whether she would see her children that night. I told myself this was strength, professional distance, emotional discipline. But it was something else. It was dominance. I told myself I wasn't targeting Muslim women. I was just not giving special treatment. That phrase became my shield. Any discomfort I felt, I buried under it. The more I repeated these justifications, the quieter my conscience became. Until one day, a file landed on my desk that should have been routine. And instead it became the first crack. I didn't know it yet. I only knew that when I looked at that name, at that woman's photograph, something inside me hesitated for the first time in years. And hesitation in a system like ours is dangerous. The file arrived late in the afternoon. That alone was unusual. Most cases were logged in the morning, processed through layers of review before they reached my desk. This one appeared without warning, flagged urgent, marked for immediate action. I remember the way my screen flickered when I opened it, as if the system itself hesitated. Her name meant nothing to me at first. A common name. A small photograph. Neutral expression. Dark eyes looking straight into the camera, not pleading, not defiant, just steady. That should have been my first warning. The report was thin. Too thin. Vague concerns. Failure to comply. Inconsistent statements. Potential influence. The language was familiar, flexible enough to mean anything, dangerous enough to justify everything. I leaned back in my chair and told myself what I always did. Trust the process. Still, something felt off. I read the file again. And again. There was no history of violence, no criminal record, no clear violation. Just a woman who had asked questions. A woman who had refused to remove her headscarf during an interview. A woman who had insisted on speaking in her own words instead of repeating the phrasing we preferred. That was enough. I could have delayed it. I could have requested further review. I had done that before for other cases. But this time, my hand moved before my thoughts caught up. I approved the arrest authorization with a practiced click. The system accepted it instantly. Within minutes, notifications were sent. Officers dispatched, procedures activated. Once that button was pressed, there was no graceful way back. I told myself that too. I didn't go with them at first. I rarely did. Arrests were messy, unpredictable. My role was cleaner, administrative, detached. But that evening, something pulled me out of my chair. Curiosity, maybe? Or the faint need to prove, to myself, that I could face the consequences of my decisions. The apartment was small, quiet, too quiet. When the door opened, she was already holding her coat, as if she had been waiting. No shouting, no resistance. Just a brief glance at the officers, then at me. Her eyes met mine, and I felt something tighten in my chest. "You need to come with us," one of the officers said, rehearsed and calm. She nodded. Inside the apartment, there were signs of a life interrupted. Shoes by the door, a half-folded blanket, a child's drawing taped to the wall. I avoided looking too closely. Details make things harder. As they escorted her out, she adjusted her scarf with deliberate care. Her hands didn't shake. Her breathing was steady. That unsettled me more than panic ever could. In the hallway, she stopped briefly and looked at me again. Not with anger, not with fear, with certainty. "You are responsible," she said quietly. It wasn't an accusation. It wasn't a threat. It was a statement of fact. I opened my mouth to respond, authority, protocol, something rehearsed, but nothing came out. The officers urged her forward, and the moment passed. In the vehicle, I sat across from her. The hum of the engine filled the silence. I watched her reflection in the glass as the city lights slid past. She closed her eyes, not to sleep, but to whisper something I couldn't hear. I didn't need to. I knew. At the detention center, the routine continued. Fingerprints, intake forms, belongings cataloged. The transformation from person to case happened quickly, efficiently. She followed every instruction without protest. When it was over, she turned to me one last time before being led away. "Allah sees," she said. That was all. I stood there long after the door closed, staring at the space she had occupied. I had done this dozens of times before, hundreds maybe. Yet this arrest clung to me in a way none of the others had. That night, for the first time in years, I didn't sleep, and I didn't know yet that this was only the beginning. People think cruelty has to be loud. They imagine shouting, violence, bruises. They imagine men with weapons and raised voices. That's not how it worked where I was. If anyone had raised a hand, there would have been reports, investigations, problems. Our system was smarter than that. We broke people quietly. Once a woman entered detention, the first thing we took was time. No clocks, no clear schedules. Appointments postponed without explanation. Interviews rescheduled again and again. Days blurred together until even simple questions. "What day is it? How long have I been here?" became impossible to answer. Then we took certainty. Nothing was ever confirmed. Nothing was ever denied. Every answer came with maybe, under review, pending. Hope became a weapon. Just enough to keep them compliant. Just enough to keep them waiting. I watched women shrink under that weight. They arrived standing straight, shoulders squared, dignity intact. Within days, their posture changed. Heads lowered, voices softened. They stopped asking questions and started apologizing. For existing, for speaking, for breathing too loudly. And still, we told ourselves we were humane. We separated mothers from children temporarily. We said it was for processing efficiency, for the children's well-being. I learned quickly never to look at a mother's face when that happened. It's easier to pretend you're doing the right thing when you don't see what it costs. Food was controlled, not denied, just delayed. Showers were limited, lights stayed on at night, silence was enforced during hours when loneliness hurt the most. None of it violated policy. That was the point. Every step was defensible. We documented everything except the fear. The woman I arrested, her name echoed in my mind even when I tried not to think of her, was placed in a shared holding area. No privacy, No personal space. Just enough room to sit, to wait, to think. I checked her file more often than I needed to. I told myself it was professional diligence, but it wasn't. I wanted to see her break. I wanted proof that my decision had been justified. She didn't give it to me. During her first interview, she answered calmly, too calmly. She didn't argue, she didn't plead, she didn't try to perform gratitude or remorse. That unsettled the officers conducting the session. It unsettled me more. When asked if she understood the consequences of noncompliance, she nodded. When warned that cooperation could affect her outcome, she listened. When told she might be detained indefinitely, she said nothing. Silence like that is dangerous. It doesn't give the system anything to work with. I began to notice how differently she was treated. Small things at first. A delayed meal, a postponed phone call, a note added to her file. Unresponsive, emotionally distant. Distance in our language meant resistance. I didn't intervene. I told myself this was not my role. But that night, as I walked past the holding area, I heard something that stopped me. Soft words, barely audible. She was sitting alone, hands resting on her knees, whispering prayers into the empty space around her. Not crying, not begging, praying. I stood there longer than I should have, long enough to feel uncomfortable, long enough to feel something I hadn't felt in years. Unease. This was supposed to be the stage where women started to unravel, where uncertainty became panic, where fear turned inward. But she remained intact, and the system does not tolerate that. The next morning, I saw the escalation request waiting in my inbox. I knew what it meant, and for the first time since I had joined this unit, I hesitated before opening a file. They called it a review meeting. That was another lie we liked. A review implies balance, consideration, dialogue. What it really meant was escalation, pressure applied with cleaner hands. I entered the interview room before she did. The table was bolted to the floor, 2 chairs on one side, one on the other. The lights hummed softly, a constant reminder that nothing in this room ever truly turned off. I arranged the papers carefully, aligning edges until they were perfectly straight. It was a habit. Control in small things, when bigger things felt uncertain. When she was brought in, she looked smaller than before. Not weaker, smaller. As if the room itself was closing around her. She sat where she was told, hands folded, eyes lowered. For a moment, I felt relief. This was the posture I recognized. The posture the system rewarded. Then she looked up. "Before we begin," one of the officers said, "you need to understand the seriousness of your situation." She nodded once. "You have been described as uncooperative," he continued. "Your lack of engagement is not helping your case." She listened without interruption. When he finished, there was a pause. The kind that stretches just long enough to make people uncomfortable. "May I speak?" she asked. The officer glanced at me. I hesitated, just a fraction of a second too long, then nodded. She turned her eyes to me, not to him. That felt deliberate. "You have power over my body," she said calmly. "Over where I sleep, over when I eat, over whether I see my children." My throat tightened. This wasn't how these conversations were supposed to go. "But you don't have power over what I am," she continued, "and you don't have power over what you're becoming." The room went still. The officer shifted in his seat. I felt heat rise in my face. Anger, embarrassment, something sharper I didn't want to name. "This is not appropriate," he said. She didn't look away. "You can write whatever you want about me," she said. "You can delay. You can threaten. But one day this won't be your desk. And it won't be your rules." I leaned forward. "Do you understand that what you're saying can affect your outcome?" I asked, my voice colder than I intended. "Yes," she said. "And do you understand that what you're doing affects yours?" The officer ended the interview immediately. Procedure restored. Control reclaimed. Or so it seemed. As she was let out, she paused at the door and looked back at me one last time. "Everyone answers," she said quietly. "Some now, some later." That sentence followed me out of the room. It followed me down the corridor, past the white walls and silent doors. It followed me into my office, where I stared at my reflection in the dark screen of my computer long after the meeting notes were submitted. I told myself she was manipulating me, that this was emotional pressure, nothing more, that I had seen it before. But I hadn't. Not like this. That night, I dreamed of files piling up around my bed, stacking higher and higher until I couldn't breathe. Names blurred. Faces disappeared. Only signatures remained. Mine over and over again. When I woke, the unease hadn't faded. It had sharpened. The next morning, a notification appeared on my screen. Deportation approved. Pending final clearance. 72 hours? That's how long I had before the system closed its grip completely. And for the first time, I wasn't afraid of what she might lose. I was afraid of what I already had. 72 hours. That was the number blinking at the top of the screen when I opened the system the next morning. Not literally, of course. The system never showed time like that. It showed statuses, green check marks, progress bars, neutral language that hid urgency behind procedure. But I knew what it meant. 72 hours before transfer. 72 hours before the file closed. 72 hours before my signature became permanent. I told myself to breathe, to slow down, to remember that this was not my responsibility anymore. The process had moved beyond me. That was the comfort the system offered. Once the machine started, no single person could be blamed. That comfort didn't work this time. I tried to focus on other cases. Emails, meetings, coffee that went cold on my desk because I forgot to drink it. Every time I looked away, her words returned. Everyone answers. I checked her file again. Nothing new. No appeals logged, no external interventions. The deportation destination listed with clinical precision. No mention of what awaited her there. The system didn't need to know that part. I did. The fear didn't come all at once. It arrived in pieces. A tightening in my chest when my phone rang. A jolt of panic every time a supervisor walked past my office. I began to notice how often doors closed quietly around me. How conversations stopped when I entered a room. I wasn't paranoid. I was observant. That skill had kept me safe for years. Now it told me something was wrong. On the second day, I went to the holding area under the excuse of a routine check. I hadn't planned what I would say, only that I needed to see her, to confirm something I couldn't name. She was sitting where I had last seen her. Same posture, same calm. As if time hadn't touched her at all. When she noticed me, she didn't stand. She didn't ask questions. She waited. "You know," I said quietly, careful to keep my voice neutral, "there's still time to cooperate." She studied my face, not unkindly. "There is always time," she said. "Just not always for the same things." I swallowed. "You could help yourself." "I am," she replied. That was when I understood the difference between us. She had accepted the cost. I was still bargaining. That night, I stayed late, long after most offices went dark. I told myself I was catching up on work. In reality, I was watching the system move. Timestamps updating, approvals stacking, inevitability forming in line by line. I started noticing loopholes. Small ones. Technical ones. The kind your bot trained to ignore because they slow things down. A missing verification. A secondary review that could be requested but wasn't mandatory. A delay justified by procedural ambiguity. I didn't act on them yet. Acting would mean crossing a line. And once crossed, there would be no returning to who I was. The third day arrived too quickly. I woke before my alarm, heart racing, the sense of being watched clinging to me like a second skin. I dressed carefully, too carefully, as if appearance could still protect me. At work, the atmosphere felt different, tighter, controlled. My supervisor asked questions he had never asked before, casual questions, polite questions. The kind meant to measure hesitation. I answered smoothly, professionally. Inside, everything was loud. By midday, the final clearance request appeared. One last confirmation before execution of transfer. It sat there, waiting. Silent, patient. This was the moment the system depended on people like me to remain predictable. I stared at the screen, my finger hovering just above the keyboard. If I did nothing, she would be gone by morning. If I acted, I would not remain invisible. For years, I had believed power came from control. In that moment, I realized power also comes from refusal. And refusal has consequences. I closed my eyes. Then I made a choice. I didn't feel brave when I acted. I felt cold. That's what no one tells you about moments like this. Courage doesn't arrive with confidence. It arrives when your options are gone and fear has nowhere left to sit. My hands were steady only because my body had decided there was no time for shaking. I reopened the file. The final clearance screen was waiting exactly as I had left it, one confirmation away from becoming irreversible. I scanned the checklist again, not because I needed to, but because habit still clung to me like armor. Dates, references, verification fields. And then I saw it. A small omission. A procedural gap buried so deep it was almost decorative. A secondary verification from an external unit that had been recommended but never marked mandatory. 99% of the time it was skipped without consequence. Everyone knew that, including me. I clicked into the subsection and requested the verification. The system didn't probe. No alarms, no red flags, just a quiet status update, pending external review. That single action bought time. Not much, but time nonetheless. My pulse spiked. I waited for something to happen, for a warning, for a message from IT or compliance. Nothing came. The system accepted my choice as legitimate. That was the most dangerous part. When injustice looks like routine, resistance looks like compliance. I logged out and stood up too quickly, chair scraping against the floor. The sound felt loud enough to expose me. I forced myself to slow down, to walk normally, to nod at a colleague as I passed her desk. Every step felt watched. The next hours stretched thin. Emails arrived. Meetings continued. The building hummed with normalcy while something irreversible trembled just beneath the surface. I kept my phone face down, afraid of what might appear on the screen. Late in the afternoon, my supervisor called me into his office. I knew before he spoke. He didn't accuse me. That would have been too obvious. Instead, he asked questions that circled the truth without touching it. Anything unusual with your cases today? Any delays we should be aware of? You're usually very efficient. I met his eyes and answered calmly. I had practiced that skill for years. The art of saying nothing while sounding helpful. No issues, I said. Just standard review procedures. He studied me for a moment longer than necessary. Then he nodded, dismissed me with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. I walked out on legs that felt borrowed. That evening, I went back to the holding area. I told myself it was procedural. A welfare check. That's what I wrote in the log. But the truth was simpler. I needed to see her before the system reacted. She was sitting alone again. When she saw me, she didn't look surprised. It's delayed, I said quietly before I could stop myself. She didn't ask how. She didn't ask why. She closed her eyes for a moment, just long enough to breathe. Allah opens doors in ways we don't expect, she said. I almost told her everything. The risk, the investigation, the fact that I had just placed myself directly in the path of the machine I had served for years. But words felt unnecessary. She already understood something I was only beginning to grasp. When I turned to leave, she spoke again. Whatever happens, she said, you've already crossed. She was right. That night, I didn't go home immediately. I sat in my car in the empty parking structure, engine off, listening to the sound of my own breathing. The city above me moved on, unaware that a single file had stalled its perfect rhythm. My phone vibrated. An internal notification. Compliance audit initiated. I stared at the screen, the words blurring as adrenaline surged. This was it. The system correcting itself, the cost of interference arriving faster than I had hoped. I leaned back against the seat and closed my eyes. For the first time, I wasn't thinking about what I would lose. I was thinking about what I had finally refused to be. And I knew, whatever happened next, there was no way back. The audit moved faster than I expected. By the next morning, my access level had changed. Subtle things first. Certain files locked. Certain tabs grayed out. The system didn't accuse. It restricted. That's how it signals that you're no longer trusted. I noticed the looks before anyone spoke to me. Conversations paused when I entered rooms. A colleague I had worked beside for years avoided my eyes. Another offered a smile that felt rehearsed, brittle, as if kindness itself had become suspicious. At noon, I was called in. Not to my supervisor's office this time, but to a smaller room at the end of the corridor. No windows, no personal items. 2 chairs, a recorder already running when I walked in. They didn't ask if I was comfortable. They asked if I understood why I was there. The questions came carefully, calmly, professionally, just like I used to ask them. Can you explain the procedural delay you initiated? Was there any external pressure influencing your decision? Did you communicate with the detainee outside approved channels? I answered truthfully, but selectively. I spoke in the language I knew best: policy, protocol, discretion. I said nothing that could be proven wrong and everything that could be interpreted later. They listened, took notes, nodded. That silence, the kind that pretends neutrality, was heavier than any accusation. When I was dismissed, they didn't say whether I was cleared or suspected. They never do. Uncertainty is part of the discipline. By the end of the day, my contract was suspended pending review. No explanation, no timeline, just suspension. I sat alone at my desk long after most of the floor had emptied, staring at the surface where my nameplate used to sit. It had been removed quietly, sometime during the afternoon. Another small signal. Another erasure. I checked the file one last time before my access expired. Her case was still open. The external verification I had requested had not yet returned. The delay held, but just barely. I didn't know if it would last hours or minutes. I didn't know if someone else would override it once I was gone. That not knowing settled into my chest like a weight. I wanted certainty. For her, for myself. But certainty was the one thing the system had always denied others, and now it denied me too. That evening, I walked past the holding area without stopping. I didn't trust myself to see her again. I didn't trust what I might say, or what she might see in my face. At home, I couldn't sit still. I paced. I replayed every moment of the past 3 days. Every look, every click, every silence. I imagined the consequences unfolding in directions I could no longer control. There were moments, brief, shameful moments, when I wished I had done nothing. When I wished I had stayed invisible. Those thoughts scared me more than the investigation, because they reminded me how easily I could have chosen comfort again. Late that night, my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. No name, no greeting. Just 4 words: the transfer is paused. I sank onto the floor, my back against the wall, breath leaving me in a rush I hadn't realized I was holding. Paused was not safe. Paused was not saved. But paused meant not gone. It meant time. I didn't celebrate. I didn't feel relief the way I thought I would. What I felt instead was clarity. Sharp and unforgiving. I had stepped out of the system's protection. Whatever happened next, I would face it without the shield I had relied on for years. And for the first time, that didn't feel like a punishment. It felt like truth. I didn't know yet what would happen to her. I didn't know what would happen to me, but I knew this: the cost had already been paid. And there was one final choice left to make. I am no longer Emily. I didn't change my name to escape what I had done. A new name doesn't erase old signatures. It doesn't undo nights spent awake knowing someone else was locked behind a door because of me. I carry those memories with me. I will always carry them. But I could not continue living under a name that belonged to the woman who believed power was permission. The audit concluded quietly. No public hearing, no scandal. My contract was terminated due to restructuring. That was the official language. No accusations were recorded, no apologies offered. The system closed ranks the way it always does, protecting itself by making individuals disappear politely. I didn't fight it. Walking out of that building for the last time felt unreal. Years of authority reduced to a badge returned at reception. My access revoked. My presence no longer required. The corridors looked exactly the same as they always had. White, calm, indifferent. The system didn't hate me, it simply moved on. I learned later, through a channel I no longer had any right to access, that her case was rerouted. Not approved, not denied, redirected. The kind of administrative detour that buys time, sometimes enough to change an outcome. I don't know where she is now. I don't know if she is safe. And that uncertainty is something I have accepted as part of my sentence. In the weeks that followed, silence settled in around me. Not the enforced silence of detention, but the quieter kind that comes when no one is watching anymore. No meetings, no approvals, no authority. Just me, my thoughts, and the weight of what I had finally seen. I started listening, really listening. I read stories I had once dismissed as exaggerations. I spoke to women I had previously categorized as difficult. I learned how easily law can become a blade when held without humility. How often harm hides behind procedure. And slowly, uncomfortably, I began to understand the faith I had once treated as a threat. Not as something foreign or frightening, but as something rooted in accountability. I didn't arrive at belief in a moment of drama. There was no single night, no sudden revelation, just a growing awareness that if there is justice in this world, it is not owned by systems. And if there is judgment, it does not end at borders or titles. When I finally chose to embrace Islam, it was not because I wanted forgiveness to come cheaply, it was because I could no longer stand apart from responsibility. I chose the name Aisha, not because it sounded softer, not because it hid my past, but because it reminded me every day that knowledge without integrity is dangerous, and that strength without mercy becomes cruelty. This is not a redemption story. Redemption belongs to God. This is a record, a warning, a refusal to let silence finish what harm began. If you are listening to this and you work inside a system, any system, know this. Neutrality is a myth. Every decision shapes someone's life, whether you acknowledge it or not. And if you are one of the women whose fear I once dismissed, whose dignity I once reduced to paperwork, know this too. I see you now. I cannot undo what I did, but I will not deny it. My name was Emily. It is Aisha now, and I am done pretending that obedience is the same thing as innocence.